This is the Master Brewers Podcast, brought to you by the Master Brewers Association of the Americas, a volunteer organization dedicated to continually improving the products and processes of our membership since 1887.
Let's go!
Master Brewers brings you interviews with the industry's best and brightest in brewing science, technology, and operations.
Calm down, I'm moving too fast.
This Master Brewers podcast is proudly sponsored by Hopsteiner, a global leader in the hop industry focused on quality, sustainability, and innovation in new hop varieties and hop products. Contact our brewery sales team to provide you with the hop-related tools you need to craft your next great beer. For more information, visit hopsteiner.com.
Additional support provided by
Get to know Proximity Malt. We malt superior, European-style, low-protein varieties grown close to home in Delaware and Colorado. Domestically grown, precisely malted to style. With our team of seasoned experts and 2 brand-new malt houses, try what's really new in malt. Check us out at www.proximitymalt.com.
Additional support provided by
The secret to quality fermentation is White Labs. Core strains are made weekly and most can ship out the next day. Order through the White Labs app or yeastman.com. Visit whitelabs.com/whywhitelabs for a new customer special offer. That's whitelabs.com/WHY Whitelabs.
You're not just getting a beer concept that comes from 1 or 2 brains, you're getting it from a whole bunch. So it gives us a wide range of creativity. It also serves as a great educating piece for folks, people who haven't brewed before, get to not only brew a beer, but get to participate in the recipe development and brewing and cellaring, et cetera, of that beer, and really, learn a tremendous amount about process.
This week on the show, Jason Perkins tells us how a beer comes to life at Allagash Brewing Company. Jason, how many new brands did Allagash release last year?
I'm not exactly sure how many beers we did last year, but we're if you include literally every single one, it's probably getting pretty close to 100.
Wow.
And some of those are, maybe that's one single keg that we poured in our tasting room for some specific event or something like that. But it's a lot.
Okay,
sure.
Cool. So I guess we get better asked the most important question that everyone's wondering: how on earth do you come up with names for all those beers that aren't already taken?
It's absolutely the hardest part. I mean, it really is. It's pretty brutal.
It used to be fun back in the day, right?
Yeah,
it's not fun anymore. No.
Yeah, it's really hard, and I will say, luckily, I'm not that involved in it anymore, and I've told the other folks involved in it to basically just loop me in at the end, because I realized that I was just putting a wrench in stuff, because they'd asked my opinion, and someone asked my opinion, I would give my opinion, and I might do it at the wrong time after that they've already gone through and ruled a bunch of other stuff out. So I was just throwing wrenches into it. So now I usually the name comes to me when they're pretty, when the couple other folks who work on it are pretty set on where they want to be. Yeah. But we do, like our innovation program in general, we do ask, usually an email goes out to the entire staff here and says, anybody want to weigh in on this? You give a little background to what the beer is. And then, people do weigh in. But the problem is a lot of times people aren't checking Untapped or Googling those names before they put them in. So many of them, 90% of the names that are suggested by staff are not usable because they're already used by somebody else.
Yeah, makes sense. The industry as a whole is a lot different than it was 5 or 10 years ago. Talk about some of the new challenges in brand development.
Yeah, I mean, it's a whole different world. I mean, if we go back to the early years of creating beers here at Allagash 20 years ago, 10 years ago, even 5 years ago, it was a lot it was just, it was easier. You could do it a little bit slower. You could just kind of casually come up with a concept and execute it and so on. But there's a lot of breweries out there. There's a lot of brands out. Every brewery's got a whole bunch of different beers. Consumers want what's new, what's different. So that poses a challenge. Timelines have to be pushed up. Partially because the industry has changed, partially because we're a bigger company than we used to be. Planning ahead for beers that we're going to sell. I mean, we're a year out on some of that planning, whereas 10 years ago we were, we'd say, hey, let's do this beer, great, and 6 weeks to 8 weeks later we're selling it, and it's just it's just so much more of a complicated world these days.
You let all employees at Allagash participate in the pipeline of new brands. Talk about that and what it does for company culture.
Yeah, it's a pretty amazing thing that we started a long time ago. I mean, I think with any great piece of culture at a company, the greatest ones are ones that grow with the company. It's so hard to insert a certain practice into a company when it's already grown. Whereas this is a good example. I'd use the same argument with safety. I think we have a great safety culture here that started when we were really small. Good quality culture, et cetera. But the way we tapped into our staff really started from the very beginning. When we were just a couple employees, they were allowed. But as we grew, we just, for a while, had this program without a scaffold around it. And then as we grew, we realized we had to kind of put a scaffold around what we already had in place. And so now, as a company of 130 or so employees, we do need some kind of structure for it. So we just we allow all employees to submit a concept to our pilot team, and we intentionally make the process for submitting an idea as simple as possible. So it's literally just a very simple Google form people fill out, and they don't need to include specific yeast strains or raw materials of any type. Depending on the individual, they may just submit a flavor that they're trying to get at, or I had this beer that inspired me, and this beer I really love. I want to do a hybrid of these two. And we do that on purpose because we realize that, we may have some staff members who have brewed here for a long time or have a big home brewing background. Those folks can submit an idea really fully fleshed out. They may even submit an actual recipe to brew on our small system. But there are a lot of employees here who love beer, but maybe don't know process as well, or haven't even homebrewed or brewed a batch at all in their life. So they can just submit kind of a concept they're trying to hit at, and then the experienced brewers on the pilot team can develop that recipe with them to get at the flavors they want to get. So what it does for us is it's hard to really capture everything, but I mean, it certainly is our innovation pipeline. It lets us tap into a wide kind of diversity of people here. So you're not just getting a beer concept that comes from one or two brains, you're getting it from a whole bunch. So it gives us a wide range of creativity. It also serves as a great educating piece for folks, people who haven't brewed before, get to not only brew a beer, but get to participate in the recipe development and brewing and cellaring, et cetera, of that beer, and really, learn a tremendous amount about process. Lets us interact with various departments who aren't necessarily on the production floor on the regular. All of a sudden, you get to spend a day out there. So it's really, like I said, it's a small program that we've slowly evolved as we've grown. So it's really a fantastic program.
Okay, talk more about that pilot team and who's on it. How many different people or departments are typically involved in this brand development process?
So the pilot team is, like as I just described, the pilot team is not the one necessarily coming up with all the beer ideas. We're getting beer ideas from the whole company. The pilot team is empowered to certainly create and be innovative themselves. But the pilot team's primary function is to kind of liaison with somebody who's submitted an idea, work with them, and brew with them. So the people on that team kind of have to have a good chunk of experience, either home brewing or brewing on a larger scale. They also have to be good people, good with people. They have to be able to talk, teach people about the process, work with them about a subject matter they may not know a lot about. So the makeup of that team is made up of, we've got several brewers on the team. I mean, I participate in the team, but I don't actually run the team. We have one of our senior brewers, Evan Culver, who's the head of that team. So he kind of runs the meetings and runs the logistics of the team. We have several other brewers on the team as well, because a big function is just, the actual making of the beer, the functioning of cellar work, etc. We have somebody from our engineering department, or engineering maintenance department on the team as well. He happens to also be an experienced home brewer, but it's nice to have that perspective from a mechanical side of things to understand what's going on there. We also have a position here we call beer to market specialist. And she participates in the pilot team as well. And that's her kind of main role in the pilot team, is to be kind of involved right from the beginning when we identify a beer that's in the pilot stage and we're decided, okay, we're going to move it from the pilot stage to the next stage. Because it is worth noting that we'll probably brew, 60 or 70 brews on the pilot system a year. And, maybe 10, 15 of those will get pushed forward from that into some next step. So there's a lot of beers that don't get past the pilot stage, of course.
So is that pilot team is always the same? It doesn't vary for each new brand that comes through, or did I get that right?
No, it's always the same. Okay. We have somewhat recently initiated kind of term limits for the team members, just because there's a lot of interest amongst our staff to be part of that team. So currently it's 2-year term limits for people on that team, but it's the same people on that team and working with it each time. Every time a beer idea is submitted, someone from the pilot team kind of raises their hand and says, I want to be the liaison for that particular idea. And so then that particular person will be the one-on-one interactor with whoever submitted the idea.
Got it. And we're going to walk through the whole process, start to finish here in a second. But one last question before we do that. Do you guys use any project management software as you're developing these new beers?
We do use project management software called Asana for beer to market process, as we call it. So we look at kind of in several stages. When it's in that kind of ideation stage, the pilot team stage, we're not using any project management software there. But when we decide, okay, it's moving from section, this area to the next area into true development, then it gets entered into the Asana project management software, which a lot of people have their hands in, and of course have lots of different responsibilities to actually get that beer to market.
Cool. Sounds good. Jason, walk us through your actual development process. How does it start? Where does it go?
We start with, of course, the pilot stage where, this idea comes in from an employee. It certainly has to make it past that first round. So that first round is, we get a bunch of ideas that get submitted and the pilot team is tasked with deciding whether it's a worthwhile beer to bring into even that system. We're only making 10 gallons of beer, so we can brew lots of different beers, but at the same time, our resources are still limited even on that scale. So every beer idea that gets submitted does not get brewed. It has to meet a certain number of criteria for us to even decide to brew it on that small scale.
And so what are those? What boxes does it have to check?
Yeah, so it first of all, I guess probably first and foremost is it's got to be sound like a good idea, sound like a tasty beer. If somebody submits something that's a little bit too over the top or out there and doesn't look like it's going to have the balance that we want, and so on. And of course, that's a fairly opinionated, nuanced decision there. As is kind of one of our other bullets here at Allagash is we call it Belgian inspired. We don't even necessarily say Belgian style per se, but Belgian inspired. When we started the brewery in '95, that was kind of right from the get-go our focus. So, luckily that's still a pretty wide range of options out there for us to kind of fit that Belgian inspired kind of description. We also needed to be what we call safe and legal. So, we want it to be with all the wacky ingredients that people are using in beer these days. We want to make sure that it's something that, is safe for us to make and legal for us to make. There was a time where we were letting folks submit and choosing beer ideas that that had some kind of ingredients that were pushing the envelope. But again, our time is limited. So, if we're not going to make it on the big scale, if we wouldn't even consider making it on the big scale, we're not going to make it on the small scale. So, we basically used a couple tests for that. One, there's the convenient TTB approved list that the Brewers Association worked with the TTB on. It's got 100 some odd ingredients on it that are acceptable to be used in beer without any statement of process being submitted for that label approval. So it's a pretty wide range of stuff from various fruits to coffees, a lot of the typical ingredients that brewers are using these days. If it's on that list, then it's an easy yes. If it's not on that list, we require that it has to be on the generally regarded as safe list, FDA list or GRAS list. And if it's not on that list at all, then it's basically a no. We won't let people. We won't even bother brewing with that on the pilot scale because it's just not really worth our time. Kind of coupled with that, we do think about practicality, and what I mean by that is, again, we use a lot of funky ingredients and funky process and wide range of yeast strains here, but when we're deciding to push a beer forward into the pilot program, we still want to think about how would this be made on the larger brew house, because there's a lot of things you can do on a 10-gallon size that just are not practical on the larger size. So whether that's a whole bunch of fruit or lemon zest or something like that you can add in a big sparge bag on a 10-gallon system, when you start to think about how that would be executed on a large system, it starts to get a little more complicated. So we just now, as the pilot team, will think about those things right at the beginning of the process. And we still do some pretty stupid stuff on the big system in the end, very labor intensive, but we got to at least be able to do that. So that's thought right at the early part of the process.
And what percentage of submissions would you say actually make it through this first phase?
Just off the top of my head, I would guess probably about 20%, maybe 25%.
Okay.
And a lot of times what will happen too is, people are submitting their ideas, even though we make it simple. A lot of times they're going outside their comfort zone. They're submitting something maybe they're really passionate about. So a flat out no can be a little harsh. So a lot of times we'll reach back out to the person and say, it's a no, but here's why. Or here's a direction you could go with this. So a lot of times it results in a resubmission that maybe gets accepted.
Fair enough. Okay, well, let's move on to sort of that second phase. So your second decision point is, are we going to sell this beer? How do you get to that point?
Yeah, again, this gets into some more nuanced conversations. We have a bi-weekly meeting that's kind of addresses a lot of this stuff. It's kind of a rolling beer development pipeline meeting. So we're kind of constantly looking at our rolling schedule of releases over the next 12 plus months, making sure we don't need to adjust things. There's certainly plenty of beers that, especially on the wild fermentation side, that don't go according to a schedule that we had set for them. So does something need to be pushed back a month, et cetera? And in that meeting as well is when we talk about potential beers that are, we're pretty happy about in the pilot stage, and whether or not they could fit into some other kind of release. And that meeting is myself, our beer to market specialist, our sales director, and our marketing director, as well as a woman who oversees our tasting room. So that group of people kind of has a variety of perspectives on what the needs in the marketplace are, what the needs of our tasting room are, what's practical for us to fit into the schedule, and so on. Typically, it's me kind of championing a beer to that group, and that stems from pilot team folks, if there's a beer that the pilot team is really fired up about. If I should also say that all of our pilot beers go on tap in our break room. So there's, just an open system for people to try those beers, provide feedback on them. So we can get some feedback via Draft Lab we use for assessing the preferences of that beer, but also just, I put a lot of stock in what I hear people talking about on the brewery floor, a beer that they're pretty psyched about. I also semi-joked and semi-serious that how quickly that 5-gallon keg is finished in the break room is a big indicator of how our staff feels about it. So, I bring kind of that knowledge to this biweekly meeting and talk about beers that I'm pretty excited about and the team is pretty excited about. And then, it allows our marketing and sales directors to really give their perspective on kind of what they're seeing in the marketplace. So instead of like a sales and marketing team coming to the pilot team and saying, we need, X type of beer ready in 6 months, it's really more, here's the kind of deep bench, I like to call it, of options that we have. And the sales and marketing folks can look at that and say, ooh, I like that one. That fits, in this time frame next year, or this one fits to just sell in our tasting room. Luckily, we have between cans, 12-ounce bottles, 750 milliliter bottles, 375 milliliter bottles, and kegs. We have options depending on, maybe we just want to do one batch of this and sell it in a limited footprint. Maybe we want to go national with it, that kind of thing. Those are the conversations that happen at that biweekly meeting.
Coming up,
it's really amazing to see how people react when their idea gets chosen, and when it's their brew day and they come to work and they realize that this is their day, that they get to step away from whatever they're doing on a normal day and brew a batch of beer.
I'm John Bryce, and you're listening to the Master Brewers Podcast from the Master Brewers Association of the Americas. Support for this podcast is brought to you by
ABS Commercial is a full-service brewery and parts outfitter. From our Raleigh headquarters to our Denver office, we proudly offer brew houses and fermenters from 3 barrels and up, yeast brinks, boilers, kegs, chillers, tri-clamp, and other stainless parts, all with the quickest delivery and lead times in the industry. Learn more at abs-commercial.com or call 877-BREW-ABS. ABS Commercial. We are brewers.
Additional support provided by
Bring the world to your brewhouse with BSG's diverse selection of ingredients and services. Our dedicated customer service team and industry experience provides you with the assistance you need every step of the way. Make BSG your supplier of choice with products essential to making great artisanal beverages so you can stay focused on your craft. Visit us at bsgcraftbrewing.com or contact us at 1-800-374-2739.
Here's what's coming up on the Master Brewers calendar. District Northern California meets at Off the Rails Brewing in Sunnyvale July 18th. District St. Paul, Minneapolis joins forces with the Minnesota Craft Brewers Guild once again for the Minnesota Brewers Conference July 26th in Duluth. The District St. Paul, Minneapolis August meeting and golf outing is August 2nd at Mighty Axe Hop Farm. The District Texas Summer meeting in Kerrville is the weekend of August 2nd. Don't miss the basic lab equipment for your brewery webinar August 8th, presented by our friend John Geritano from episode 64. District Rocky Mountain meets August 14th at New Terrain Brewing in Golden. Master Brewers Brewery Systems Technology and Maintenance course starts August 18th in Madison. And the District Ontario Hop Field Day is August 24th at Good Lot Farmstead Brewing Company. Registration is now open for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference in Calgary. We'll have a local on the show next month with some insider tips, but be sure to tack on a couple of extra days to enjoy some amazing hiking and make the 45-minute trip to Banff, which is one of the most picturesque places on the planet. Check out the full calendar of events at MBAA.com for more details or to find a district meeting near you. Now back to the show. assuming a beer's made it through those first two phases and you're definitely going to sell the beer, let's talk more about that distribution and that sort of that final decision point about, where and how you're going to sell it.
Sure. Yeah. And, I will also say that the preferred way for us to bring a beer out to the market, and it doesn't always work this way, but the way we prefer to is, starts with a pilot beer, of course, moves to the second stage, and it's a single for us. We have a 30-barrel brew house and a 75-barrel brew house. So the perfect first step beyond pilot would be a 30-barrel batch. And that would be sold most likely just in our tasting room, maybe a little bit in bottles or a little bit in cans and a little bit in kegs. That's kind of stage one. And that really allows us to kind of see how the actual process on a larger scale went, the brewing process and cellaring process. Lets us, do some packaging tests and so on in a controlled amount, and really see how the beer is received by the market as well. And then after that, if it goes further than that, which it doesn't necessarily have to go further than that, then we step it up to some kind of a national release, whether that's a one-time national release. We do a lot of that. We don't necessarily do seasonal beers, but we do beers that we just release, once a year to our national footprint. Or potentially, although this doesn't happen as much, a new year-round available beer.
So I'm curious about the involvement of your distribution partners. Do they get involved at all before sort of that decision point 3? I'm kind of wondering, like, how often does a new beer that the brewery's really excited about, does that ever just get shut down at the last minute by distributors, or do you get a thumbs up or down from them, earlier in the process?
That's one part of the process that, the distributors really aren't involved in any of the beer development process here. Other than once a beer, if a beer goes to national release on a one-time scale, certainly that can give us feedback on how it did in the marketplace and how the wholesalers feel about it. But no, we're typically, we're communicating our release schedule to our wholesalers, around, the fall, around annual business planning meeting time. And that is what it is.
So what else drives those decisions about when and where and how a new brand will be sold?
It really is. It's the part of this process that doesn't have strict rules to it. Not that we have strict rules really in any of it, but it's a pretty nuanced process where, again, it's a conversation between marketing, sales, and myself on what we feel is a good fit at a given time. For what kind of beers the marketplace is excited for, what kind of beers we're excited for. We've managed to keep it a pretty organic process throughout, and that's that plays a big role in it. I will say one other thing that we've done, I think we've done a really good job of in the last in the last year. We've really increased this is when we decide to move a beer forward. And, we name it, you talk about naming being one of the hardest parts. We actually won't even put the beer kind of into the project management software, into Asana, until it has a name and potentially even kind of artwork associated with it. Maybe the label's not done, but if it's a beer we're going to sell in a can or a bottle, we'll actually work on the name, the look, and potentially the whole label before it really even gets into like the actual, other steps of the beer development process. And this, it's an important part of it is, what's the beer name going to be? What's the packaging going to look like? What's the elevator pitch for the beer? What's the story behind the beer? Before we get too much further along, because that's an important part of it as well.
Will that happen for the ones that that are just going to be tasting room only too, or will you sometimes just kind of shoot some stuff in the tasting room and worry about some of those details later on?
Yeah, I mean, I'm kind of referring to the beers that we're selling in a can or a bottle,
okay.
And even if that's just in the tasting room, so it's really small batch. Those are the beers we're doing that with. out of the, whatever I said, close to 100 beers that we'll do in a given year, there's a whole bunch of ones that are just going into the tasting room. And, we've got, especially, if we pull, a handful of kegs from our wild beer program and do a special blend that, we're just doing in there, or fooling around with some new fruit. That's a lot of beers we're doing in there. But a lot of times those beers, we know just inherently by the way that they're made, that they're never going to go beyond the tasting room. They're pretty small scale. So, some of the beer development burdens that you have for other beers, you don't have with those. So naming can be simpler. You don't need imagery and labels behind it, and so on and so forth.
Going back to that big number of, close to 100, brands a year, do you have a target for that number, or is that just what happens and it's an organic process?
Yeah, it's really whatever happens. And there have been times, and I think we're kind of in one right now, where, it waxes and wanes in terms of, is our innovation program keeping up with what is needed? And there are times where for a long time, we came nowhere near close to keeping up. Like everything we did was sold in a second and it was gone. And, we weren't making as many different beers, but the program wasn't necessarily keeping up with demand. But then there were times where, Naomi, our sales director, is just like, what, we got to pump the brakes a little bit here. There's only so many beers you can sell, especially at the wholesaler level. When you're getting, our sales department, our marketing department, our wholesaler partners can only, apply so much energy to Allagash in general. And so, if we have a whole bunch of beers at a given time, it can be pretty challenging for them to even find the energy to be behind those. So,
yeah, it's good to have that deep bench though, because then you can pick from the best of the best, right?
Exactly. Yeah. And it's key to communication between, I think, I have just a great working relationship with Naomi, our sales director, and Jeff, our marketing director. And it's just that having that open line of communication is so important. And it seems like such a simple thing, but, again, back to the time where we couldn't keep up with the needs. Like I wasn't honestly communicating as well as I probably should have with the sales and marketing departments. But it didn't necessarily matter as much back then, because everything we made was just going out there. And now it's really important to have that back and forth communication about what's needed out there.
I'm curious about the brand development timeline. Does that vary significantly by brand, or can you say that, hey, for a given brand, it's usually about a X month process?
It varies dramatically, and it varies dramatically with kind of where our needs set. We had a beer this year that was the first time we'd ever gone from pilot to national release, a beer called Darling Ruby. And that just the stars kind of all aligned with that. We were all really fired up about the beer. There was a spot in our release lineup that fit for that beer, so that was pretty fast.
I imagine it also really matters too if the employee submitting it already has it like very clearly defined and has a recipe and all that. I imagine that probably has a big impact on the timeline.
That certainly helps for sure, definitely.
So how much fine tuning is typical? I know you said, in an ideal world, you're going to do the 30 barrel batch first. Do you oftentimes end up doing several of those before you scale up more, or no?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, we wouldn't move, as much as we love a concept, if we're not happy with the way that concept tastes at the pilot stage, we're just going to keep brewing it. So, there's been some, usually maybe a simpler process beer, simple recipe beer. And maybe we can get away with just piloting once. Typically, it's at least twice that, we'll brew a second 10-gallon batch to make sure the flavors are where we're at, make sure we can repeat what the certain flavor impacts that we had. But there have certainly been times where we've piloted a beer 4 or 5, 6 times even before moving it forward. And then when we move it to the 30 barrel size, again, depending on how complicated the process is, we'll occasionally even brew a 30 barrel batch that we don't sell, 30 barrel dump batch, we call it, which is kind of crazy to think about, especially if you're not in the brewing industry or if you're not at a brewery brewing at the scale that, not that we're that big, but at the scale we're brewing, it's kind of like crazy to conceptualize that you're going to brew a 30 barrel batch with the intent of not selling it. But we've really found for certain beers, for us to stand by the quality of the beer, we feel that that's a necessary thing for us to do. We feel lucky to have a pilot program, our pilot system, a 10-gallon system. But the reality of it, everything doesn't always translate exactly, especially when you're using, odd ingredients or an odd fermentation process when you go from that 10-gallon up to 30. So, there's a handful of times a year where we'll just identify, we're really excited about this beer, but we got to see how it's going to do on a large scale. And so we'll brew a 30-barrel batch, ferment it out completely, and then package, depending on what package it's intended to be going into. So if we think we'll sell it in cans, we'll package it in cans, bottles, etc. And we'll package kind of the minimum that we can. So really a handful of cases. And that's partially for sensory evaluation. It's also probably most importantly for seeing how it ages, seeing how it acts in the package, especially when we're talking about that be a mixed fermentation beer, for example, a beer that we want to really test the stability of over time. So that's something that we do a couple times a year. If the process is a simpler beer, a beer that we're pretty confident in, then we'll often sell just in the tasting room the first batch.
How about, you started to get into it, but I was interested in hearing more about the challenges of scaling up a recipe like that. What are some of the things that you have the most trouble with scaling sometimes?
Yeah, I mean, just straight up sizing up grain and hops, the simple stuff is really quite easy. It's the other stuff. It's if a beer is using two different yeast strains, say, or we've had a couple beers that we've brewed same wort stream fermented with two different yeasts and then blended back together at a certain blending ratio. Like those kind of things are hard to scale up. And then using weird, whether it's lemon zest or grapefruit juice, we've done that with a couple beers recently. Those scaling up that is probably one of the bigger challenges. How the impact of zest or orange peels on a larger scale, it's going to be a little bit different.
To what extent does yeast management factor into your decision-making process and development cycle? I mean, if you're bringing forward new brands that have, a totally different yeast, and that adds a lot of variables to the whole brewery operations.
Yeah, it most certainly does. I think our QC team would say that we don't think about it as much as we should at the time, because it's we kind of make our life a little more complicated here than we probably should. But as from the very beginning, we've been kind of, I guess you could say, a yeast forward brewery. So we often fool around with many different yeast strains in a given year because we feel like that's an important tool in our repertoire to create different flavors. But it absolutely creates complications to bring in additional strains, especially when you start to talk about some of the, SDA1 diastaticus yeasts that are available out there. Factoring that in that side of things is complicated.
Do you have any interesting advice or anecdotes on sort of your approach to working with new yeast strains when you aren't familiar with their various quirks?
Yeah, I mean, I think anytime some kind of forced fermentation tests are always good to do early on. I mean, we'll even do that at the pilot scale sometimes if we're working with a new yeast strain we're not familiar with. I wouldn't say we always avoid SDA1 positive yeast strains, but it definitely is a conversation for sure early on in the process, because that just adds a layer of complexity to everything. Forced fermentations are the big one, and that's one of the biggest factors for us to decide that we need to do one of those 30-barrel dump batches. Is if we feel like we need to really see how that yeast is going to operate on a larger scale.
A couple more sort of more technical brewing questions. I'm curious if you have many challenges in regards to sort of predicting beer color as you scale up from that very small batch to the larger batch. Is that something that maybe you've just gotten really good at knowing those two systems, or is that something that it can be a struggle at times?
We haven't had too much of a struggle with that. I would also say I don't want to say we don't worry about it, but it's not as an important piece to us at that stage. Color is certainly an important thing to control for a core brand, something that there's an expectation set ahead of time. For a beer like this, if we're off by a little bit, then what was the expectation was of the brewer, we're not too worried about that.
Can you talk about how maybe you plan for and manage pH throughout your process with these, new brands?
Again, nothing complicated there. We do very little pH adjustments. We adjust our pH in our mash, and that's it. And we do so on the small scale the same way we do it on a large scale with food grade lactic acid. And we're on the pilot system. We're doing that with a pipette. We're just taking a little pipette out of our normal drum of lactic from the brew house and throwing that into the mash. So really quite simple on that side, and that's all we really have to do in terms of pH adjustment throughout the process.
One of my least favorite things in brand development is providing marketing with beer descriptions and flavor profiles for beers that either don't exist yet or are still in process. How do you manage that?
Yeah, I agree. That is absolutely a challenge. In a perfect world, we have time with the pilot. We actually have the pilot batch to work with. So, we'll run that through. We have a descriptive panel here that runs once a week. It's one of many sensory panels we run here, and the descriptive we run once a week. And so we can throw the pilot batch into the descriptive panel, and then it'll spit out a list of common descriptors of the beer. Of course, many of those need to be massaged a little bit, if you will, because a marketing department or a consumer isn't super wild about reading about isoamyl acetate and ethyl acetate, et cetera. So, you kind of translate the technical terms into a little more romantic terms and create a description that way. That's our preferred way to do it. If the timeline's a little tighter, we have to kind of, we'll sit down and describe the beer best we can based on, assumptions that we have about the flavors we're trying to get at.
The pace of innovation feels a lot faster than it used to, or maybe I'm just getting old. Do you have any tips for other brewers out there in regards to keeping with the pace and the pressure to constantly churn out something new and different, but still keep innovation natural and human?
Yeah, it is a big challenge. You're absolutely right. Things are moving so fast now. I think for us, probably the biggest tool of all is having this deep bench of options to pull from. So, having a whole bunch of beer ideas that we can pull from at any given moment enables us to keep the process organic. It kind of occurred to me not that long ago that, this process has been our kind of beer development and our pilot process has always been a very organic, from the employee naturally moving beers forward that we're passionate about. It's always kind of been that way. And it, kind of light bulb went off in my head, not that long ago, where realizing that, we can't the only way we can keep operating that way is to have this wide range of options and to get ahead, to really move the timeline up, if you will. So, potentially thinking about beers that we're developing, that we're brewing on the pilot system right now, are beers that we'll sell in 2021, not 2020.
Yeah.
And now we're not necessarily quite there, and there are certainly some beers that we move forward quicker, but it kind of realized that for us to keep this process the same as it always has been and organic and from the ground up, which was really important to me personally, was we really had to build that bench up. And so for us, that's the most important thing, to keep up with the needs of the marketplace and still keep things organic.
You consider this a success even if the beer doesn't make it out of the pilot phase because one of your employees got to brew something, got to get involved with the process, got to learn something. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, we definitely look at it that way. I mean, I think and I think any employee who's taken part in the pilot process would feel the same way. It's really amazing to see how people react when their idea gets chosen, and when it's their brew day and they come to work and they realize that this is their day, that they get to step away from whatever they're doing on a normal day and brew a batch of beer, and learn process and hang out with one of the brewers and so on. And then their beer goes on tap in our break room and they get to see their coworkers drinking it and telling them how much they like it, or maybe they don't like it, but either way, having that communal kind of feeling of participating in something that everybody gets to enjoy. So yeah, we absolutely look at, even if the beer ends at what we call decision point one, our decision after decision point one, where the beer has been brewed, that's still a huge success story.
That was Jason Perkins here on the Master Brewers Podcast. If you want to learn more about brand development at Allagash, you can do so by accessing one of the great resources that comes with Master Brewers membership, the District Presentations Archive. Thanks to the efforts of volunteer district officers like Debbie Newstifter-Smith, members can download both slides and audio of the presentation Jason gave during the 2019 District Michigan Winter Conference. Check the show notes for a link or use the meetings tab at MBAA.com.
I'm moving too fast, and then I fall on the ground.
Are you enjoying the Master Brewers Podcast? Let me tell you about a simple way you can help us keep making more. Take a minute to thank our sponsors. There's no way we could produce this show without generous support from sponsors like Hopsteiner, ABS, Proximity Malt, White Labs, and BSG. So please let them know you heard their message on the Master Brewers Podcast and that you appreciate their support. It's time to start making plans for the 2019 Master Brewers Conference. If you can only make it to one conference in 2019, this should be it. We're really mixing things up this time and heading to the Calgary Convention Center to see how Alberta celebrates Halloween. You can find all the details on the meetings tab at mbaa.com.
And I'm heading out to any other place. My fist full of courage, my heart full of rage. I can't get stuck, I can't